Today we'll be talking about gender identity. You'll see from the title that it is complex. Now I have helping me here a 16-page document that was done in 2017 by the Assemblies of God. You can actually Google that, find it online if you want to go deep into the issue. I'd recommend you do that. I really enjoyed that particular document. So we are talking about the LGBTQIA plus community. When the whole discussion started, it was the lesbian and gay issue, but then it expanded. Each acronym here, each letter represents a different section of a larger community, just reflecting how incredibly complex the issue is. So we start with LG, lesbian and gay, the homosexual community, genders that are attracted to people of the same gender. They represent 1 to 2% of U.S. population, with men outnumbering women. The B stands for bisexual, those who are attracted to both sexes. This represents 2 to 4% of U.S. population, women outnumbering men. The T, transgender, is roughly 0.6%. The Q used to be queer. I always understood that to be a pejorative term towards male homosexuals. Now it represents questioning, and there are no percentages attached to that because it may reflect a very wide number. I represents intersex, 1 to 4%. A represents asexual, those who have no sexual attraction, approximately 1%. And then the plus at the end is for etc. Anybody who does not meet the former criteria, but who don't follow a more traditional view of gender attraction. So what does Scripture say? What do we find in Scripture? People are quick to go to passages like Romans chapter 1, verse 26 and 27. That's why God abandoned them, men who did not worship God, to their shameful desires. Even the women turned against the natural way to have sex and instead indulged in sex with each other. And the men, instead of having normal sexual relations with women, burned with lust for each other. Paul condemns this. Some are quick to go to passages like that. It is certain that the Bible does have not only this, but many other passages in which homosexuality is condemned. But there is an advantage in not looking at the negative, but at the positive. What is it that God truly desires? Going all the way back to the creation of man and woman. Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. After the story of the creation of man and women, we get a comment plugged in here by the author. This explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one. Why is this a comment? Because of the reference to father and mother. Adam and Eve don't know what a father and mother is yet. This is not God talking to them. This is Moses later, or the author of Genesis, expressing his conclusion that on the basis of God making one man for one woman, that is the norm. And indeed, That's what we find in the rest of Scripture. God's norm is one man, one woman. When we look at it in those terms, we have to recognize that sexual aberration extends beyond homosexuality. Adultery and fornication form part of this mix too. Let me explain the difference between those terms. Adultery is what takes place when a married person is attracted to one other person. A woman being attracted to two men, or a man being attracted to two women. That is adultery. Fornication is what happens when a person is interested in sex for sex's sake. They're attracted to many partners, whether that is by sleeping around or going out and seeking prostitutes, or by going online and seeking pornography. The common denominator there is, for that person, sex is all about personal gratification. All of these is condemned, and in fact, when we look at Scripture, we see that adultery and fornication are condemned far more often than homosexuality. So as we look at homosexuality, let's recognize that this is not the only practice at issue here. Why is homosexuality, the LGBT community, so strongly criticized by the evangelical church? The fact of the matter is sin is sin. And usually when we find references to homosexuality, it's in a much larger list that includes other sins like adultery, like fornication. Culture assigns ranks to sin. There was a period of time in which premarital sex was condemned, not just by the church, but in general. You should be married before you have sex. That's the exception today rather than the norm. Culture has shifted. That adultery became not necessarily an acceptable norm, but it became widely known. So much so that it's hard to find a television show in which adultery is not one of the key factors that's talked about, that's practiced. Culture continues to shift. And part of the shift of culture today is a move towards saying anything that pleases you is acceptable. That being the case, we have to understand homosexuality in those terms. Does that mean that it's acceptable? No, of course not. Neither is adultery, neither is fornication, neither is premarital sex. They are all sinful activities. I'm simply saying that culture makes homosexuality a difficult thing, and typically the older you are, the more difficult it is. So the question really becomes, what do we do with someone who declares themselves homosexual? The thing that I like about the Assemblies of God paper is it gives a 4 characteristic response. It says, first of all, that responses are going to be difficult. The first characteristic that should govern our response is self-examination. Let's not see the speck in our brother's eye when we have a plank in our own eye. Recognizing that adultery, that fornication, These are matters that, in God's eye, are identical, are just as bad as homosexuality. Let's examine ourselves, first of all. Let's examine ourselves for other sins. Sins like prejudice and sins like even rudeness as we talk to people and deal with people. The second characteristic is hospitality. I love that. Looking to embrace people, even people who are different from ourselves, to let them know that they're appreciated and they're loved, even though their sinful actions are not appreciated. The third characteristic is the characteristic of holism. As we deal with someone who states a distinct gender preference, we have to recognize that they're a whole person. We need to start questioning why. What is it that causes this? Some would say that these are simply genetic preferences. There has been no decisive proof that homosexuality is a genetic preference. The gene has not been identified and accepted by the scientific community. That seems to be more a political statement. The final characteristic is the characteristic of patience. These issues require a great deal of patience, especially as people wrestle with their gender identity, seek to understand how it is that God has created them. My friends, these are not easy issues. I would simply plead with you. Be patient. Be hospitable. Embrace those who are different from you. Let them know you love them. Let them know you appreciate them, even as you let them know that you disagree with them. We'll come back tomorrow and we'll talk about how to accept a person who is different from ourselves. See you tomorrow.